Hello my quilting friends! Leah Day here with a new video for the machine quilting party. Today we're quilting our rainbow log cabin quilt with a fun design called Bright Star. The best part of this design is we're going to knock out the whole center of the quilt so we get the hardest part of the quilting process done first. So let's get started marking this design with masking tape so that way it's easy to see and follow with walking foot style quilting. So I'm going to begin this step by taking out all of these pens and pen mores, at least in this section where we have the red and the orange. And this is because I'm going to use masking tape to mark this section. And we're going to work a quarter of the center at a time. So the design that we're going to be filling in here is Bright Star. And it's basically straight lines that run from the center to these outer edges. But lining this up can be a little tricky if you just kind of did a random arrangement. So what we're going to do is we're going to pay attention to these piecing lines and let our piecing guide our quilting design. So what I'm going to do is come from the center and stitch a straight line to this point. Then I'll skip a point and stitch a straight line to this point, skip another point, come out to here, then to here, then to here. So by using the piecing, I can space out my design really nice and evenly, and I can use masking tape to mark it really quick too. So I'm going to start here on this straight line. I'm going to run from the center point down to this point in the piecing. So I'm just kind of pulling on this nice and tight so it's nice and straight, and I'm putting that little bit of tension on it as I mush down that side, and then I'll just slide my hand all the way down, and that smooths it out nice and straight. Now to remember that I don't want to stitch beyond this point, I sometimes like to just go like that with my tape, and whenever I have a boundary line, something like this, then I know not to stitch beyond it. Now here's the thing that I learned as I was layering tape and playing with this design is that you can actually do more than one line at a time. So, it would certainly even now save time to just run to the machine and stitch along this, because we don't have to sit here with a ruler and a marking pencil. So already we're saving a bit of time, but we could save even more time by only having to shift to the machine once, for this entire section. So here I'm going to stretch out another piece of tape. And this time I'm going to go from the center to this point. Again, I'm putting a good bit of tension on this. I'm stretching it nice and tight so it's nice and straight. Goes on, smooth it out. There we go. So if I line up with this edge, you can see I can stitch along that coming from the center. I can then remove that piece of tape and I can stitch the next one. So by layering it this way, and you kind of have to think about it a little bit to figure out how you can do your layers so that as you layer more tape, it doesn't affect, the next thing that you're stitching. And you kind of have to think about it. What I realized is you're layering the tape in a counterclockwise direction. So this is counterclockwise. We will stitch it running through the machine coming from this direction. So we'll stitch this line first, second, third, fourth, and fifth. And it goes really, really quick. So here I'm lining up. I've got that line marked. And this is so much easier to do because we did that stitching in the ditch and got the layers of the quilt stable. Now, if I was trying to tape this over and around all my pens and, trying to deal with that, it would be a little bit trickier. I'd have to leave those pens in place. So if you don't like the idea of stitching in the ditch, maybe you could just do a little bit of hand basting over this area or machine basting in this area. That could work too. Okay, one last line, and I just want to make sure that I can still see that center point right there. As the tape gets layered up, it can be easy to lose track of that. And here we go. Line that up. Now, another thing to always be in mind is that you're always going to be stitching on that same outer edge of the tape. Don't stitch on this side because you can see you'll just kind of stitch to some kind of weird random spot. You'll want to be stitching along the side that lines up with that point. And it does help to have a little tape line kind of running perpendicular so that way you don't accidentally stitch off your line and go way into the yellow because, we're going to have another cool design out here next. So now that a quarter of the bright star design is marked with tape, we're going to shift this to the machine and begin quilting it together. So I'm here at the machine and I've already done a lot of sliding and scrunching to get half the quilt here in the arm of the machine. But I want you to pay attention and see how more than half of this is also behind the machine. This is the importance of having nice big tables all around your machine so that way it can take the quilt and you can put the bulk of it behind rather than in front of you or on your lap. So here I've slid in and I've got, this is right at the beginning, that very center point of the quilt. And I have to say, this will be the hardest section to quilt. The bright star in the center is the trickiest. We blaze through this, get it done in one day, and I promise it will not feel this hard as we move further out. The thread that I am using here is the Isocord 1030 passion fruit, so it's the orangey kind of color, and I think that's going to look really nice. It's going to contrast with the red, and it's going to kind of sort of blend in with the orange, so I think that's going to look really nice. And I have that set up in the top and bobbin of my machine, so that way I'm not going to get any kind of weird tension issues showing up on either side of the quilt. I'm going to get beautiful thread on both sides. So I'm kind of just a little bit over on my tape, so I'm going to adjust this, make sure I'm right in the center section, and I'm going to hand guide, just grab my hand wheel and rotate the needle down and bring it all the way back up to the point where the needle's starting to drop back down again. Tug on that top thread, and that brings up the bobbin thread. So now I have both thread tails on the surface of the machine, tuck those underneath that walking foot, and then I drop my needle right back down right in that spot. Okay, now I'm going to slip on some gloves because I really find that that helps get control over this quilt and helps me manipulate it and move it easily. Now my goal here is just simply to stitch and stay right on the edge of the tape. I want to try not to stitch over it. I just want to stitch right next to it. And I like lining up the tape right with the needle so that I am running the needle right along the edge of that tape. That works for me. If that doesn't work for you, you can kind of just experiment with it and see what works best for you. As for settings on my machine, I've got it set so the needle always ends in the down position. That way I can stop and shift and wiggle things around a little bit every time I stop, and it's not going to shift away. So if I left the needle in the up position and I started pushing and pulling on the quilt, it could potentially shift away from the needle and cause me to have to break thread and reset. It would cause a weird stitch. My stitch length is set to 1.5 millimeters. I like a really small stitch personally. I just think it looks nice, but you could play with that too and go with a bigger stitch length if you want to do fewer stitches in your quilt and have bigger, kind of a chunkier look. That would certainly be open to you as well. And please understand that all of this stuff bears experimenting with. It really is good to try lots of different things. Okay, so as I'm working out from that center, it is feeling easier, but you see I might have this little bit of kind of, it's like the tape is kind of pulling up on the fabric a little bit. So what I'm going to do is flatten this out completely. I'm going to reach underneath and make sure it's nice and flat to the tabletop. I'm going to lift that tape and smooth that out and then pull on the tape and reset it. You don't want the tape to cause pleats or puckers on your quilt, and it's just sticky tape. I mean, it's going to do whatever you've done with it, it's going to do. So I sometimes notice that it can do some weird pulling action, and if part of that is also my puffy batting. I've got some real thick puffy wool batting here in this quilt, and that could also be affecting it too. So whenever you lift the tape, just lift it up and pull tight. That's going to make sure it's a nice straight tight line. I'm going to take off my little end here because it's in my way. I'm going to reset that. Now it's nice and smooth and I don't see any kind of ripples in the fabric there. There we go. Nice and flat and smooth. If ever things are looking lumpy, bumpy, pleaty, whatever, stop and shift and play with it. You got to get into the mentality of fiddling around with it until it's right and then get started again. And it's, it's a little slow. It's a little bit of a stop-start process, but you see, it just took me a second or two to fiddle with that and make sure it was right. And now I'm on track. And the actual stitching goes really fast. You can put your foot down on this. It's just straight line stitching. And we're aiming for that point in the stitching, in the patchwork, you know, in that log cabin where it splits from orange to yellow. That's what I'm aiming for. And I might even lift the tape so I can really see what I'm doing here right at this last tip. There we go. I'm going to stitch right up to it, lift my needle, and then slide it away. So I'm not going to break thread short. I'm going to lift my needle up and then shift the quilt away and make nice long thread tails, so that way I can tie them in a knot and bury them in the middle of the quilt. Now that bobbin thread tail is kind of stuck on the back of the quilt right now, so I want to bring that to the surface so that way it doesn't get stitched and end up looking weird back there. So I just take a needle and tug on that top thread, and that brought up the bobbin thread to the surface. I can just go on ahead and tie these off and bury them so that way they're secured. I've got another video on that, so make sure to watch it. I go into a lot more detail, a lot slower, step by step, but I just want to show you that you can incorporate hiding your thread tails into your quilt. You can incorporate this as a habit so that you keep your cheater needle real close by, and then you can just tie off and bury as you're making those broken thread tails, rather than trying to have to wait and save them all for the very end, which is really frustrating and time consuming. So there we go. That's clipped off, ready to go. And now we're done with that entire piece of tape. So we just remove that one piece. So you just take that off and throw that away, and then now shift back into the center, and we're going to line up with this next piece of tape. Now we've still got this thread tail to deal with. I do think it's good to go on ahead and tie this off and bury it. It's a little bit long, so I'm going to break it short so that way I can control it a little bit better. So it's important to go on ahead and tie these off as you go, one by one, just so that they're not in your way. You might find as you are starting from the center, from the dead center of the quilt, you might find that things build up in this spot just a bit too much. What you can do is you can start some of these lines maybe a 1/4 inch off center. So you're not starting exactly in that dead center spot. You're starting just a little bit out into the quilt, and that can certainly help. So with this one, I'm going to aim about a 1/4 inch from that center to pull up my thread tails. So here I'm going to drop the foot. Sometimes whenever you're tugging on the thread and moving the quilt and stuff, you'll end up with a really, really long top thread tail. So I just break that and make it a little shorter. You know, about 5 or 6 inches is plenty. So here I drop the needle down, brought that bobbin thread up to the surface, tuck both thread tails underneath the foot. So much of this is habit. It's routine for me. I've done it so many times that it's super, super quick. So if you struggle with these steps and are just a little slower, please don't feel bad about that. That is completely normal. The more you do this, the more of a habit and a routine it will become. So here we go. We're starting that second line. I really hope that you can see just how fast this is going to be. You can knock out all of these, bright star lines through 1/4, and you only have to watch and repeat 3 times. I love systems like this where, if I sit down and I'm able to knock this out in maybe 30 minutes, then I'll time my day around that and be like, okay, 30 minutes. I'm going to do a 1/4 of that bright star. Then I'm going to go take a break, check email, do something like that. Then I'll come back out and do another 30 minutes, do another 1/4 of the bright star. That's half of it knocked out. And I just kind of break it up that way. And then, in less than a day, got the entire thing stitched and done, and it's finished. And it's so much easier once we get the center of the quilt knocked out. It'll be so much faster and easier to keep on going, because there'll be obviously less bulk in the arm of the machine, less quilt to be managing and dealing with. So there we go. That's that line stitched. And I hope you can see just how much faster that one was. As we work around and you get more practice with this, it's going to be that much faster too. So here I'm finished off and tying off that thread tail. I'm just going to pull that to the surface just so it's not making a mess on the back, but I won't tie that one off right this second. I'll maybe wait and have 2 or 3 to tie off at once. But I will always tie off these starting ones where I begin. I'm going to go on ahead and tie that off because I'm beginning the next line really close by. And again, please watch the other video where I go into a lot of detail and explain exactly how to do this step by step. So I have made my way all the way around my Bright Star with more straight line quilting, and then now I have taped and prepared this last little section. And I wanted to give you another shot so that way you could really see and focus on how I'm moving and manipulating the quilt into the arm of my machine. So let's pull it all the way out actually, and I'll show you how I load it. So once you get the quilt into the center, you really don't have to pull it all the way out again. I have managed just by simple rotations to get around. So here on the edge, I'm just accordion pleating it. I'm just kind of pulling it into the arm of the machine and letting that fabric fold back and forth in on itself. And I just keep squishing until I get to the center. And then that looks good. It feels good. As you come around your Bright Star, you might want to double check where you began your lines of stitching by pulling back that tape. And here it looks like I started that line of stitching just a little further out. So I'm going to pull back the tape a bit and pull up my thread right on that spot where the stitching began on the other side. So this is a cool thing that you can do with Bright Star. You don't have to start right in the dead center, but you do generally want those lines to line up. So here I'm pulling up my thread tails, getting everything situated, and I've still got the quilt, it's a little bit bulky. It's a little bit all over the place. So I'm going to lift this up and do a pull through on the arm of the machine. So what I'm doing here is just tugging that excess bulk of the quilt through the arm. It makes things just a little bit more bulky right here, but so long as I can flatten out this area right around the needle, about 5 inches around the needle, I'm going to be okay. And this is really the bulkiest spot. Once I stitch out of here, it's going to be a-okay. I'm just getting started, so I'm adjusting everything, making sure my stitch length is set right, making sure my needle's going to end in the down position, and I'm just going to start stitching. So I've moved the tape just so it's out of my way, and then now I can slide it right back into position. I'm lifting the foot with my knee lifter, and then now the tape's back in position. I can kind of squish it down with my walking foot and now use it as a guide. So whenever you're matching up your lines, like a line that you had before, you want to make sure that it's kind of forming the same angle with the line on the opposite side. You might have to shift your tape around like that and play around with it just when you're first doing those first few stitches. But then once you get it all laid back out again, you can put your foot down and really start rocking and rolling. Okay, so what happens when things are not working? You'll know things are not working when the quilt is not feeding for you, meaning that you should be able to take your hands off the quilt and it continue to move. And if suddenly your stitches get really small or it stops moving completely, without the aid of your hands kind of shoving it through the machine, then you know you really do need to reposition. You need to play with things, shove more quilt through the arm like this. And also you could spread out to the back. If you don't have enough space to the back of the machine or to the left side, that's really where your struggle is going to come from. Put an ironing board up, put a little side table, whatever you have to do to lift the quilt up, keep it on the same level as your sewing machine. This is really the key to quilting big quilts on your home machine, is your table setup. And I say this all the time, but I really think a smaller machine and a better table, a bigger space, a flatter table where everything's on the same level, is actually better than a bigger machine, because ultimately it's the table that's taking the weight of the quilt, and it's also where the quilt is positioned, so that way you can easily shift it around and get it where you need it to go. Now, at all times when I am manipulating the quilt through the machine. Really, the walking foot's doing the work, but my hands are doing a lot of work too. I'm feeling the quilt, and I'm feeling for multiple layers. I'm feeling for lumps and bumps and wrinkles, and that lets me know this might have folded back in on itself. Because of the way we accordion pleated it, it could easily fold back on itself, and then you stitch through 6 layers instead of just the 3 that we want to stitch through. So you've got to be careful for that, and constantly be feeling and squishing and like, okay, well, that's a seam allowance I'm feeling right there. You know, and if you think you might be feeling more than that, reach under there and slide your hand underneath the quilt. Shift it around, you know, get it where it needs to be, so that way you're not accidentally stitching the quilt back and around to itself. All right, so there's that line stitched, and I'll break these thread tails nice and long. As you stitch more of these lines, it's going to speed up so much. But this initial bright star is probably going to feel the most challenging. And this is going to be the part where you're like, oh my gosh, I can't do this. I can't quilt a quilt this big all in one big piece. And you might be looking at ways to like cut it in pieces or something like that. But I promise you, if you take the time to put a table behind your machine, put a table to the left side of your machine, it's going to make it so much easier. Okay, I'm going to tie off this thread tail and talk a little bit more about shifting the quilt after I get this tied off and buried. So I pulled up thread and I'm working my way down this next piece of tape. And I want you to see that the quilt is really not flat. And I do have a good bit of it here on my lap. It's falling off the front of the table just a bit. And that's okay. So long as this area right in front of the needle is loose and able to feed in smoothly, that's all right. Now, if it was pulled tight here over the lip of the table, then that's going to be a struggle, because you see it's not able to actually, it doesn't have the strength to pull that up and around the edge of the table. So you've just got to keep it kind of up and fluffy. Then keep it on the table and keep it fluffy so it's easy to move. It's easy to slide straight under that needle. And then as you're quilting more of the line and you get more of it processed through the machine, then start shifting and squishing it through the arm. I found for the most part, you know, I really didn't have to do a whole lot of shifting through the arm of the machine. Mostly it was just making sure that this extra, I always had a little bit extra here in front of the needle, so that way it could slide in and just be fed in real easy. You know, the walking foot does the work for you. You know, it's evenly feeding the layers of the quilt together. It's working with the feed dogs on your machine. You gotta give them some excess fabric though in order to be able to do that. They're not super powerful, you know, and certainly the weight of a big heavy quilt can be enough to pull against it and not let it feed evenly. So I'm just going to continue working, quilting the remaining lines. I've only got 2 more lines to stitch. I'd say overall this probably took about 2 hours to knock out. It really wasn't very time consuming. Of course, I had to tie off and bury all of these thread tails, but even that wasn't a big pain. This is a very quick and simple way to knock out the hardest part of your quilt. I think it's the best way to tackle the rainbow log cabin and fill it full of a beautiful design. And here's what it looked like whenever I finished the center of my rainbow log cabin quilt. So that's it for this video. I hope you learned a lot about quilting Bright Star in the center of this quilt. Now, if this felt like a struggle, please check out the other video on your sewing machine setup and tips for setting up your sewing machine so it works better for quilting a big quilt. That's really, I think, the key to quilting big quilts. But also keep in mind, it's only going to really feel like a struggle for a little bit, because our next design, we're going to be getting into the yellow and green sections. So we're going to be so much further away from the center, and there's going to be less and less bulk of the quilt in the arm of the machine. So everything's going to get easier from here, I promise. Now, if you're just getting started and joining in the fun of this machine quilting party, you can find the pattern in our book, Explore Walking Foot Quilting with Leah Day. This book comes with 30 quilting designs plus 7 beautiful quilt patterns, all geared and designed to teach you everything you need to know about walking foot style quilting. So I hope you'll come and check it out at leahday.com/walkingfoot. Now, if you're looking for all of the other videos we've shared to this project so far, you can find them at leahday.com/2018party. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel on YouTube so you don't miss the next video coming out soon. Until next time, let's go quilt!